Good morning. This is Crystal Woods with Seasons in the Vine, and it's Fresh Friday. Different wall. It's actually an old door, an outside door that we switched the hinges on so that it could give the room like a lot of aesthetics and just a sense of history. Anyway, so welcome to the study of Esther, where we see the providential hand of God intervening in human affairs in such a supernatural, powerful way, even though in the entire book, God is not mentioned at all. It's a story of the Jewish people. But my question I wanted to start out with today for you is, when did Esther take place? Like, when is this story in the history here? Because in the Bible, it's Ezra, Nehemiah, Esther, but that's actually not how it unfolded. And so you have to know that about the canon. The canon is put together very specifically in clumps that don't necessarily have to do with like historical dating. All the prophets are together. We have history together, the poems and Psalms and Proverbs, and then with the law. And so we just have different things happening. But Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther, how do they fall into place? So we know that Babylon takes over the southern kingdom, which contained the tribes of Judah and Benjamin, and they were in exile for a long time. That's called the exilic period. And then they begin to come out. And they begin to come out under Artaxerxes, which is actually Esther's stepson. Artaxerxes started ruling in 464 BC. He was the stepson of Esther, and he issues the decree to Ezra, which we see documented in Ezra 7:1, to return and establish worship. So Ezra goes from Babylon back to Jerusalem with some men. There's progressions of people returning. And what happens is the temple is restored in the book of Ezra. We see the return to the law. And then we see the restoring of the wall around the city of Jerusalem. And that's what takes place in Nehemiah. But Esther is actually before those two books. And so somewhere along this line here, because we know that Esther becomes queen and she's married to Xerxes, or Artaxerxes' father, even though she's not Artaxerxes' mother, she's married to Xerxes the first, and his reign is 486 to 464. His name in Hebrew is Ahasuerus, which is really tricky to say. So I'm going to probably fluctuate between Xerxes. Who would have thought Xerxes would be easier to say than Ahasuerus? But I'm going to flip back and forth, but no, it's the same person. One's the Greek rendition, one's the Hebrew rendition. Anyway, this happens before that. Artaxerxes is the one that sends them back, but Xerxes is the father of Artaxerxes, and that's who we're dealing with in the book of Esther. So timeline here is actually in the canon after Ezra and Nehemiah, but we're picking up historically before. What we also need to know is, not that you need to know, but Nehemiah and Ezra are linked together because it's like the same unfolding of restoration of the temple, restoration of observances, and then the restoration of the wall of the city. Okay, so let's get to Esther, and I'm going to move through pretty quick. I'm going to go through quickly, so just hold on. Hit pause when you need to if you're taking notes. What I want you to be focusing on is the providence of God in this story. Look at all the people he's moving about. Look at all the things in history that he's shifting and moving around to bring Esther into the position that she needs to be in order to save his people, the very people that Jesus Christ, the Savior of the world, will come through. So this is paramount. And so we have to think, how did Esther get into this position? Well, that's what chapter 1's about. We're going to see how Esther got there. Okay, now, in the days of Ahasuerus, the Ahasuerus who reigned from India to Ethiopia over 127 provinces. So he's giving us, the author of Esther is giving us some information that this is the Ahasuerus who reigned from India to Ethiopia over 127 provinces. So he is mentioned specifically in Ezra 4:6 and Daniel 9:1. He's the father of Darius, or his father. His father was Darius the Great. His mother was Atosa, the daughter of Cyrus. Those are some other names in history at that time. All right, let's look at verse 2. In those days, when King Ahasuerus sat on his royal throne in Susa, the citadel, in the 3rd year of his reign, he gave a feast for all his royal officials and servants. The army of Persia and Media and the nobles and governors of the provinces were before him. Okay, so let's take a look at 2 and 3 kind of clumped together. So King Ahasuerus has an elaborate palace in Persepolis, Persepolis, however you say that, another city. But he also has a palace, the citadel, for the winter time. Temperatures in this place in the world are very extreme. And so the winter palace was in Susa. That's where we end up now. Susa was in Western Persia and still exists today. It's called Shush, S-H-U-S-H. And it's in the southwestern part of modern Iran. So if you know where Iran is, then you will know where Susa was. And there you kind of have an idea of like, okay, what's the topography? What's the elevation? What's the climate like there? Then you know what we're dealing with here. That's why context is important. We kind of understand what the people were living with, what kind of lifestyle they had in that area. Now, verse 3, we hear of Media. So Media was in northwest Persia near the Caspian Sea. So once again, get a globe out or search your phone. Over there in the Mediterranean, a little bit up, you're going to see the Caspian Sea, and you'll be able to place, I think it's a little bit up, I'm maybe a little rusty, but that side of the world, look for the Caspian Sea. It was in northeastern Persia near the Caspian Sea and was once its own separate nation, but it was conquered in 550 BC by Cyrus the Great, who founded the Persian Empire. So the Babylonians took over Judah, the southern part of Israel as a whole, but those leaders changed, they conquered more, and the empires changed names as well. So now we're dealing with the Persian Empire. Let's see, so the timeline of this and the presence of so many important people, this is probably why most historians think that this is when Xerxes, or Ahasuerus, was planning his invasion to Greece. Okay, so he would have needed a lot of support for that invasion in Greece, and that takes place 480s BC. Okay, while he showed the riches of his royal glory and the splendor and pomp of his greatness for many days, 180 days. And when those days were completed, the king gave for all the people present in Susa, the citadel, both great and small, a feast lasting 7 days in the court of the garden of the king's palace. Okay, so first you need to know that that garden was amazing, absolutely breathtaking. It's not like what we would think of a garden. Outdoor spaces were really important then, and this would have been to the nines. Absolutely amazing. Wonderful, beautiful, exotic stones brought in, mosaics, plants, just really stunning. So what you need to know is the 180 days is probably not continuous feasting, but rather festivities that were punctuated over 180 days. And what is he doing during that 180 days? He's showing off his wealth and splendor. Why? Because he's trying to build an army. He's trying to make people very confident in his military campaign and what he wants to do. He wants them to believe that they can take Greece. And so they're having probably planning sessions among the war leaders to determine strategy, and he just is looking to impress. Be wary of people that want you to see how rich they are. Think about the Deception series. All right, so after the 180 days, there's this great feast. Then there were white cotton curtains and violet hangings fastened with cords of fine linen and purple to silver rods and marble pillars. This is all the explanation of where they're at. I told you it was really amazing. And also couches of gold and silver on a mosaic pavement of porphyryl, marble, mother of pearl, and precious stones. So these stones, they weren't dyed. They were brought in because they were colored, and then they would take these colored stones that were quarried and put them out in these mosaics. Really, really spectacular, amazing attention to detail. And the drinking, verse 7. Drinks were served in golden vessels, vessels of different kinds, and the royal wine was lavished according to the bounty of the king. And the drinking was according to this edict. There is no compulsion, for the king had given orders to all the staff of his palace to do as each man desired. And Queen Vashti also gave a feast for the women in the palace who belonged to King Ahasuerus. Okay. Very interesting. So no compulsion meant that each person could drink their own way in as much or as little. The king really is a boss. He can determine even how much someone drinks. And so he's given liberally, though, this decision to each individual person. Now, separate banquets that we see like Queen Vashti doing is actually super common at this time for the women to be able to have their own time. A lot of co-ed mingling just wasn't what happened. And so the separation of the men and the women was super common, and given elaborate feasts for women was what they did in that culture. All right, now let's look at verse 10. On the 7th day, when the heart of the king was merry with wine, he commanded Mehuman, Biztha, Harboni, Bigtha, Abagtha, Zethar, and Carcass. Don't you want to hear me say that again? The 7 eunuchs who served in the presence of King Ahasuerus to bring Queen Vashti before the king with her royal crown in order to show the peoples and the princes her beauty, for she was lovely to look at. And we know that King Ahasuerus has got a thing for pretty women. All right, so let's take a peek here. On the 7th day, he calls in these eunuchs to go get Queen Vashti. Okay, so eunuchs are castrated men. I want to look at my notes. Among other duties, they served in the royal harem. So they were close to the king. They did whatever he wanted, but one of their things that they commonly did was take care of the royal harem, which is where all of the king's women were that he wasn't married to, or however you want to phrase that, but not a good thing. Not something that we would see is a godly thing. But these eunuchs were there. Now, why were they eunuchs? Well, the king didn't want anybody getting frisky with his ladies. And what happened is if one of them got pregnant, like, would it have been an heir? Because who got her pregnant? He wanted to make sure nobody was getting these women pregnant except him. Then you have the confusion over the heirs. It would have been a problem. And we don't really want any of those women getting pregnant anyway, because he really needs to have an heir from the queen. Okay, so men who worked in close proximity with the king would be castrated in order to keep them from getting ideas of getting frisky with the harem or wanting to take the king over. Not too much testosterone was allowed in the presence of the king. It was his way of making sure that his reign was not going to be questioned. Remember, these were very territorial people, and kingdoms, when somebody lost a kingdom or somebody died, I mean, all their relatives had to be slaughtered. There could be no heir left. I mean, it was just a brutal time. Now, one thing we need to know is there's this Greek historian called Herodotus, and he reports that Persians typically made really important decisions while drunk and then validated them when they're sober. Okay, well, that's really interesting because it says when the heart of the king was merry. So they've been drinking a long time, but that was very common to get super drunk, make a decision, and then actually try to validate it when you were sober again. Let's take a look at what Queen Vashti did. Verse 12, but Queen Vashti refused to come at the king's command delivered by the eunuchs. At this, the king became enraged and his anger burned within him. Verse 13, then the king said to the wise men who knew the times, for this was the king's procedure towards all who were versed in law and judgment, the men next to him being Karshina, Sethar, Admatha, Tarshish, Meres, Marsena, and Memucan, the 7 princes of Persia and Media, who saw the king's face and sat first at his kingdom. Okay, what does all that mean? I'm going to help you understand. Okay, so there's no reason to believe first that when he called her forward to show her beauty, that he wanted her to do anything immoral or like vulgar or exposing, like in a sexual way. There's no reason to believe that. Persian women, though, especially Persian women of this status, went about in enclosed carriages. So you need to know culturally, women were not exposed to the general public that had this kind of status. So if this was the case, as Josephus, an ancient historian, believed was true about this story, he presents that Xerxes would have been requesting Queen Vashti to do something beneath her status, beneath her station, demeaning to her royal personage. So it was kind of like a dig. And she was like, psh, I'm worth more than that. I'm not coming to your party. Well, that's a problem because even though she doesn't want to be exposed to the entire citadel population, because that would have been such great humiliation, not giving way to the king is a no-no. You cannot do that. So she's in big trouble. Now, we don't know who Vashti is. If she's a mastress who became who became the mother of Artaxerxes, if that's who Vashti is, because the names don't line up with historical documents, we're not really sure, then perhaps she refused to go to the banquet, not only because of the social implications, but also because maybe she was pregnant with Artaxerxes, but there's no way to know exactly who this queen was because they had so many queens and they changed. And Vashti, the name, is not used in the other historical documents. So there's no way to know for sure why she denied the king's presence, but it is completely unacceptable to say no to the king. He must be obeyed at all times. Now we see that the author here goes on to this breakdown of these wise men, these officials. So the wise men were official advisors to the king. They were the ones that saw his face. That's what that means. They're well-versed in the law and judgment and great at making decisions in accordance with the law. So the king had his smart guys, his advisors near him to help him figure out what to do with this woman. Now, you need to know wise men played very important roles in the ancient Near East. That's where in history we're talking about. It's called the ancient Near East. It's a long, long time ago, very specific culture to this particular part in the world, right? And so wise men were super important. They were very knowledgeable in the government and how it should function. An important person to remember is Daniel. Daniel was considered a wise man in Babylon. And so he got this special prestige. They were very, very important. So the king has brought all of his boys together. His wife disobeys him and he's like, what do we need to do about this? Verse 15, according to the law, what is to be done to Queen Vashti because she's not performed the command of King Ahasuerus delivered by the eunuchs? And then Memucan said in the presence of the king and the officials, not only against the king has Queen Vashti done wrong, but also against all of the officials and all of the peoples who are in the provinces of King Ahasuerus. So he's saying, like, when she says no to you, she's actually making a problem for everyone because what's gonna happen? Oh, now we see what they're afraid of. They're afraid of some women getting a little loosed. They're afraid of some women saying no. And that is a fear that they have as men. For the queen's behavior will be made known to all women, causing them to look at their husbands with contempt, since they will say, King Ahasuerus commanded Queen Vashti to be brought before him, but she did not come. So it would give permission to all the other women to say no to their husbands, which was a major problem. Now, verse 18, this very day, the noble women of Persia and Media who have heard of the queen's behavior will say the same to all the king's officials, and there will be contempt and wrath in plenty. Okay, let's pause there for just a second before we go on to 19. So we just need to kind of encapsulate all of that. They're very afraid that she's setting an example of being able to say no, not only to the king, but as a wife to say no to her husband. This would have broken down the entire structure that they had. Okay, let's look at verse 19 and bring it home. If it pleases the king, let a royal order go out from him, and let it be written among the laws of the Persians and the Medes, so that it may not be repealed, that Vashti is never again to come before the king Ahasuerus, and let the king give her royal position to another who is better than she. Okay, so remember, they're making the decisions wildly drunk, and then they're going to find the ramifications of them the next day and say, we were smart in our drunkenness, and we're going to stick with this. So that's just the way they did things. Verse 20, so when the decree was made by the king and it was proclaimed throughout all of his kingdom, for it was vast, all the women will give honor to their husbands, high and low alike. That was the decree that came. This advice pleased the king and the princes, and the king did as Memucan proposed. He sent letters to all the royal provinces, to every province in his own script, and to every people in his own language, that every man may be master in his own household and speak according to the language of his people. So they wanted to make it clear, like, hey, she did wrong and she's going to be punished, and you have to obey your husband. So verse 19, never again, this idea of like, she's never again. Let's look at that. And let the king give her royal permission to someone else. If it pleases the king, let it be written. I got to find it. Oh, that Vashti is never again to come before the king. Wow. What does that mean? It implies possible divorce, the end of her queenship, or a demotion to the harem. We're not really sure exactly what those ramifications are, but just by the wording alone, we can say like, ooh, this is trouble. But why is it important? Because this is how Esther comes onto the scene, because the king needs a new queen. Okay, now this idea of sending the letter out, the proclamation of the king to all the places, this is like an ancient pony express. It was super effective, relatively quick. And you know, in that day and age, word didn't get out very quickly, but it was very effective and actually pretty speedy to do it this way. We can also understand that they were even using these means of spreading things even by the time the New Testament letters are written, going out to all of the churches. So that's the kind of system we can probably relate to, thinking about the Pony Express. There was something like that in the ancient times, and that's how information got out. Okay, so we finished chapter 1. What's the application piece? This whole story, remember, is about God's providence. And in this chapter specifically, we see how Vashti is removed so that Esther can take her place in God's big plan to save his people. He moved these people around. He used their own free will. Vashti's like, heck no, I'm not coming. He used the pride or the rebellion. He used the king's foolishness and his drunkenness to make such a rash decision and to be so prideful about it, and for them to be so afraid that the precedents would be sent that all women would begin to rebel against their husbands. All of that God used. He used all of those things to actually move Esther into place. So my question for you today is, can you trace the hand of God's providence through your own life? Providence is you're not playing a role. This is just when he breaks through. You didn't pray it, you didn't speak it, you didn't see it coming, and yet he still rescued you. He still moved on your behalf. He intervened in your affairs, in what was going on. That is God moving on behalf of his people, and he does this. They're doing nothing on their own. That's what providence means. And it should bring us comfort to know that if I miss it, if I don't know, God's hand is still working for me and toward me because it's his purposes and plans. So we can rest and trust when we realize that even when we're off base, that even when we miss it, he is redeeming and moving all things around for his purposes in our lives and for his plans to come to pass. So what I want you to think about this week is, how have you seen the providence of God in your life? How have you seen his hand coming when you didn't know better, or maybe you even did, and you didn't do what needed to be done. You acted foolishly, and still his hand kept you. He intervened. He got you that job. He saw what was coming in advance. He moved on your behalf. You weren't in that accident. I don't know. You have to ask the Lord, but that's how I want you to take the story of Esther and make it personal, because he did a whole lot of moving through people's decisions and his providential hand to get Esther into position. So how has he done that for you? I'll see you next week. Happy Thanksgiving.